I'm Larry Pope, and I've taught science for over 25 years. Early in my career, the science presented in textbooks was causing me to question my faith. I then stumbled onto Dr. Brown's book, In the Beginning. It was a life-changing moment for me as I began a new hobby of studying the sciences from a different perspective. Science now strengthens my faith, and I teach classes about that in my church. Every time I use the following slideshow to teach the Hydroplate Theory, a member of the class will request that I make it into a video so they can share it with others. The following presentation is my interpretations of Dr. Brown's Hydroplate Theory. I've included some of my own thoughts and observations as I believe they correspond to his theory. I'm only able to summarize some of the many things that are covered in the book, so for a more complete understanding of the theory, I would recommend reading the book. In John 5, verse 46 and 47, Jesus says, "If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words?" Moses wrote Genesis 1 through 11, the creation story, which has been widely rejected and ridiculed for the last 150 years. In simple terms, how could Mount Everest, 29,000 feet above sea level, be covered with water? If so, where did the water go? Dr. Walt Brown has developed an outstanding theory to scientifically explain the events of Genesis. Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory uses many scientific facts and the assumption that there was a layer of water under the continents, referred to as the fountains of the great deep in the Bible, to explain many geographical features of the earth listed in this slide. The scriptures on the previous slide and this one indicate that the pre-flood earth could have been on top of a chamber of water. Dr. Brown believes that this subterranean chamber of water contained dissolved salts and carbon dioxide and was under increasing pressure. Seismometers and deep drilling provide scientific evidence for the existence of the fountains of the great deep. Flood stories from every continent and the scientific evidence provided in the rest of this slideshow are a compelling argument that the great deep burst open, causing a global flood event that changed the shape of the earth. A child can see that the continents appear to fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Attempts to do this result in failure because they just don't quite fit. Dr. Brown proposes that if we move the continents in their current shape in to the mid-Atlantic ridge, then they fit better. Like the breaking of a water balloon, the water would have followed the path of least resistance. As the fountains of the great deep escaped, the land was eroded. The rain stopped after 40 days, but the flood continued for 150 days. The waters escaping from the great deep continued to maintain the flood until the Lord closed the fountains of the deep. Dr. Brown's theory suggests that the subterranean chambers were full of dissolved salts. He also believes that the rupture happened in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The highest concentrations of salt water occur in the Atlantic Ocean. As water hammers jetted rock and water away from the earth, some of the water would have fell as rain. Some would have froze in the mesosphere and fell as hail. Some may have escaped the Earth's gravitational pull and become comets. Some of the rocks may have escaped the pull of the Earth's gravity and become meteors that we pass through, forming meteor showers. Some may have begun to orbit the sun, becoming asteroids. Some may have bombarded the Moon, Mercury, and Mars, forming their craters. The hole in the ozone layer is not addressed in Dr. Brown's book, but I believe its origin could be explained by his hydroplate theory. In 1979, a hole in the ozone layer was discovered and a study of it began. Rocket launches have been known to deplete the ozone as they pass through. Maybe the origin of this hole is when the fountains of the great deep burst forth rapidly and continuously ejected Earth material through the ozone layer and into space. Maybe the hole was over the Atlantic Ocean before a change in the Earth's axis of rotation that will be discussed later. The side of the Moon facing the Earth should be protected from crater-forming impacts. Yet it has craters, so how did they get there? The Moon, Mercury, and Mars all have similar crater formations in that one side of them they have large craters and not as many. The other side they have smaller craters and more of them. Possibly these impactors came from Earth during the rupture of the fountains of the Great Deep, forming large impacts on one side, followed by smaller impacts on the other side from the debris. Mammoths and other animals have been found in a frozen muck inside of the Arctic Circle. The frozen muck is a muddy ice substance known as rock ice and covers approximately 1/7 of the Earth's surface. The mammoths are found frozen in lifelike positions amongst plants and animals that require a warm climate to live. When things die, they fall over and decompose. The mammoths, however, are found in lifelike positions frozen in the muck. Dr. Brown proposes that the mammoths and other animals were buried in a muddy hail that fell as a result of muddy waters from the rupture, freezing in the mesosphere and returning to the Earth. As the flood prevails on the Earth, convection currents and tidal pulses caused by the pull of the sun and the moon on the waters sort sediments and bury organisms in debris. Fossilization is rare under current conditions. If a cow dies, it is eaten by scavengers. If a leaf falls off a tree, it decomposes into soil. If a fish dies, it floats. Organisms buried in organic soils will decompose rather than fossilize. Fossilization requires rapid burial in the right kind of sediment. Ground up rock and dissolved lime settling out of the floodwaters buried thousands of plants and animals. Tidal pulses caused water lenses for the animals and plants to get trapped in and then fossilized. Dead fish float rather than sinking to be buried in sediment. By the time they sink, they've been torn to pieces by scavengers. However, the fossil record is full of fish. This fish and many others must have been buried alive in flood sediments. This particular one was still in the process of eating another fish. Many organisms are found fossilized in struggling positions as if they are gasping for oxygen to survive. Many fossils of soft tissue exist. However, they are rarely formed under current circumstances because they must be quickly buried in minerals to be preserved. If they are not quickly buried or are covered in organic soils, they quickly decay into soil. Rapid burial in a flood would explain why there are so many. In several places around the world, trees are found standing vertically in rock layers. Some of these are upside down. Trees fall over and rot. They don't stand around waiting for rock layers to build up, and they definitely don't turn themselves upside down. In Spirit Lake, after the eruption of Mount St. Helens, some trees absorbed enough water to orient themselves vertically in the water. Add ground up rock and dissolved lime settling in around them as they precipitate out of the floodwaters, and you get a polystyrate fossil. Bones are often found in random piles where both predator and prey are scrambled together. As floodwaters recede, sticks, leaves, and other sediments are left in piles. Boneyards must be debris piles left behind as floodwaters receded. The news reported that the skeletons were nearly complete, with similarities in their death poses. Since they were found in various layers of rock, the researchers concluded that this must have been 4 different episodes spanning several thousand years. The thought that whales would remain intact, fossilize on top of each other, and be oriented in a similar manner over several thousand years is absurd. The fossilization, orientation, and location of the whale fossils is much better explained by a global flood. Dr. Brown believes that the sorting of sediments into layers and the general sorting of fossils by types happened in a process known as liquefaction. As the water in the bottle on the right enters the sediment bottle on the left, from the bottom up, sediments begin sorting themselves into layers. Dr. Brown explains in his book how this process took place during the flood phase and also during the compression phase of his theory, as plates fluttered and then compressed. Earthquakes, tidal waves, and tsunamis discussed later would have contributed to the liquefaction process. The Geology Museum in Rapid City, South Dakota has an awesome display of fossils that have been excavated from the Badlands and other nearby areas. It is supposed that the layers represent geological time. What is missing is an explanation of how the layered strata is laid down so evenly without signs of wind or water erosion between the layers. Also missing is an explanation of how the organisms avoided being devoured by scavengers and decomposition to be so well preserved. Where in the layers are the massive amounts of soils that would need to exist to grow the plants that fed the animals that are fossilized in the layers? I believe liquefaction and the hydroplate theory is a better explanation of the evidence. We find salt in domes that traverse through solid layers of rock. The layers of rock must have been saturated with floodwaters, and the less dense salt dome was able to rise up through it. The rock layers later solidified. With continents separated by erosion and pushing down on the underlying basalt with enormous pressure, a situation is created where the ocean floor would rise in the eroded area. Mid-ocean ridges are the result of this process. There are mountains from the southern tip of South America all the way up the western edge of the Americas to Alaska. These were formed as the hydroplates slid away from the mid-Atlantic ridge and crashed into the ocean floor. The result was bending, buckling, and melting of rock. Folded mountains appear to have been formed when the material was still soft from the heat of sliding plates and the saturation of floodwaters. Some of the continental material would have broken free and slid over the top of other continental material, forming overthrusts such as the Lewis overthrust and the Matterhorn. Most of the Earth's seismic and volcanic activity take place in an area known as the Ring of Fire. Friction of the granite continents crashing into the ocean floor would have melted tremendous amounts of rocks, rapidly forming volcanoes, lava flows, and dome mountains. When plants die, they decompose. It is hard to imagine this much plant material avoiding the process of decomposition long enough for layers of rock to form on top of it and produce the heat and pressure necessary to form coal. A better explanation would be if the plant material becomes saturated in the flood and settles to the bottom in large amounts. Tidal pulses sort the sediments into layers based on densities. The sliding plates produce the heat and pressure needed to transform the plant material into coal. With the exception of the Ozark Plateau and the Appalachian Mountains, the elevation of the U.S. increases as you move from east to west. The abrupt stop not only formed mountain ranges, but it thickened the plates. With the thickened continents rising out of the floodwaters, runoff would have carved river valleys and drainage basins. Look at the width of a large river valley such as the Mississippi or the Missouri rivers. Try to imagine slow processes carving the enormous width of those valleys through solid rock. Sediments from the highlands are filling the valleys in. A much better explanation would be rapidly moving floodwaters draining off the continent through material that is still soft with saturated floodwaters. I took my family to visit Yellowstone National Park. We traveled south and then east across the Wind River Reservation on our way home. A road crew was excavating a mountain to make room for a wider road. The majority of the material that was being excavated was rolled river rock. Massive amounts of this rolled granite were scattered through the Wind River Reservation. How did so much rolled river rock get buried in the mountain and scattered across this portion of Wyoming? Sliding hydroplates could have crushed the granite into small pieces. Months of rising and receding floodwaters coupled with earthquakes and wave action associated with rapid crustal movement could explain it. The rock was still saturated with floodwaters. As water in the rock made its way to a nearby valley, it carved out caves. In Cave of the Winds in Manitou Springs in Colorado, there is a pothole in the ceiling. It is likely that whirling rocks caught in an eddy ground the hole in the ceiling as waters quickly escaped. After the cave's formation, dissolved lime slowly seeped out of the saturated rock, the water evaporated, and stalactites and stalagmites were formed. In Genesis, God saw that all he had made was very good. He also tells us that 150 days is equal to 5 months, which would have been 5 30-day months. Before the flood, there were probably 360 days in the year, forming 12 30-day months. Calendars of many ancient cultures are based on a 360-day year. The circle is divided into 360 degrees. Before the flood, the moon probably took 30 days to orbit, making a very good clock for everyone to see. A famous study by George Dodwell concludes that there has been a slow shift in the Earth's axis of rotation. Dr. Brown proposes that the sliding hydroplates produced a shift in mass that caused the Earth to wobble. The wobble caused a shift in the axis of rotation. Coal and fossils of tropical organisms formed as a result of the flood in temperate latitudes and have shifted to Arctic locations. The melting of rock from the sliding plates and wobbling earth caused the earth to shrink and its rate of spin to increase, adding days to the year. When you suck the air out of an empty water bottle, it starts to wrinkle as the opposite side is being pulled toward the suction. It may be possible that as material was being removed from the Atlantic side and the ocean floor rose, the opposite side of the earth moved that direction, deepening the floor of the Pacific and forming wrinkles known as trenches. Sliding plates produced elevated continents and warm oceans. This would have magnified evaporation rates, causing hundreds of inches of snow to fall for many years after the flood. Repetitive freezing and thawing and the pull of gravity compacted these snow events into layers of glacial ice, creating an ice age. As the continents sank and oceans cooled, the snows weakened and the glaciers began to melt away. As glaciers melt, less sunlight is reflected and more rock is exposed to absorb the sun, melting more of the ice. The glaciers have been slowly retracting since their formation after the flood. When you push something into a bucket of water, the water level rises. As continents sank into the ocean floor, sea level rose. The green area is land that is currently underwater but appears to have been exposed in the past. The red dots are locations where human artifacts have been found underwater. The large red spot marks an apparent city that is approximately 700 meters below sea level. Enormous canyons are found below sea level in places that don't have enough water flowing fast enough to have carved them. They were carved as floodwaters escaped the continents and then sank below sea level as the continents sank and the oceans rose. Dr. Brown proposes that there are two areas in Utah and Arizona that held floodwaters for years after the flood. Eventually, they gained more runoff from the snowmelt in the Rocky Mountains than they could hold and broke the natural dam that contained them. In a matter of weeks, the escaping waters carved the Grand Canyon. Mike Snavely has made an excellent DVD to explain this event. In the petrified forest in Arizona, thousands of pieces of petrified wood are located in an area that doesn't currently grow these trees. Pre-flood trees soaked up silicates as they floated in the post-flood basin Dr. Brown refers to as Hopi Lake. As these waters quickly drained to form the Grand Canyon, the trees were left behind to dry out and become petrified. Studying science from a biblical worldview had a great influence on my own work, in which the war of worldviews is a pillar to the conflict throughout the story. The book was published by Christian Faith Publishing in March of 2020 and is available through a number of online vendors including Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Walmart, and Target.